Hello, I'm Sally Tuckett and I'm Lecturer in Dress and Textile Histories at the University of Glasgow, and this video is going to look at the clothing of enslaved people in the 18th century, giving a sense of what was worn and how it compared to that of the slave owners. Clothing in 18th century society served a very important purpose. Just like today, it offered layers of protection against the elements, protecting you from the rain, the cold, the sun, but it was also integral in denoting your social status and your wealth, and even your moral character. Wealthy Scots, for instance, such as the Glassford family from Glasgow, used their clothing to make a statement about their place and position in society. John Glassford, seated on the left, is dressed in a very fine three-piece suit, probably made of either silk or fine woolen cloth. You can see he's also wearing fine silk stockings and has lace cuffs at his wrists. The expensive white wig, the extra material at the cuffs of his jacket, even the multiple buttons and buttonholes, all speak to a man that did not have to do manual labour to support himself or his family. He relied on the labour of others, and this would have been just one of many outfits that he actually owned. The portrait in general, and the clothing in particular, is saying that he's a successful and respectable member of society who can afford the finer things for himself and his family. Glassford was one of the tobacco lords of 18th century Glasgow, and we can glean information about his clothing from accounts, letters, and of course portraits like this. Similarly, we have information about what other plantation owners, even in the Caribbean War, thanks to correspondence and household bills. Sometimes we're even told what they felt about their clothing or how their clothing made them feel. But what do we know about the clothing of enslaved people, who were the basis of these men's fortunes? Most plantation owners provided some clothing for their slaves on a more or less regular basis. Slaves in the American colonies, for instance, were typically given 2 outfits a year, warmer woolen cloth in the winter and linen in the summer. But these outfits were generally just the bare minimum, and if the slaves wanted any additional items, they would have had to acquire them themselves. So these often took the form of smaller things like ribbons or handkerchiefs. For the basic wardrobes, men were given a shirt, a pair of loose trousers and a jacket, while women were given a shirt or a shift, a skirt, and an upper garment called a jacket or a waistcoat. Slaves in the Caribbean will have had similar allocations, although they probably had less need for the heavier woolen cloth given the climate. Plantation owners purchased the materials for their slaves in bulk as this was more cost-effective. Linen probably constituted the bulk of their purchases, and it was often of a coarse, unbleached quality, which would have been a far cry from the crisp white linen that you saw in the Glassford portrait. This didn't mean that it couldn't be decorated, however, and you could get it in striped or checked patterns, as you can see in this painting here. In many cases, though, the fabric that was distributed to the slaves was actually produced in Britain. The northwest of England, for example, produced much of the coarse woolen cloth that was needed, while Scotland produced a coarse linen called Osnaburg, which was shipped in vast quantities to the American colonies and to the West Indies throughout the 18th century. There is even some reference to tartan being shipped out to the Caribbean, but it's unclear whether this was for the slaves or for the slave owners. Some plantations also set up their own textile manufactories on site, so their slaves were making the fabric for their own wardrobes. Ultimately, the clothing of the slaves had to be practical. As the foundation of the plantation economy, they had to be able to work, so they wouldn't have been given the restrictive clothing that was worn by the slave owners, for example. The mistress of the plantation, for instance, if she was receiving company or was out visiting, would have worn a pair of stays, which is an undergarment that's very similar to what we would consider the corset today. Field slaves wouldn't have worn such a garment, and some would argue that this was an acknowledgement on the part of the slave owners that it would have been restrictive and uncomfortable to wear while they were doing their manual labour. It's much more likely, however, to have been an issue of economy and cost, as stays were very expensive to make, so you're unlikely to make them if you own hundreds of slaves. Much of the visual evidence we have of slaves working in the fields in the Caribbean plantations shows them dressed in loose clothing, often even simple loincloths, as you can see in the right of this image here. This is very much an idealised image of slave society, and it highlights the problems we have when we're trying to understand life from the slave's perspective, even their clothing, as little to no evidence comes directly to us from them. Images like this often show slaves looking healthy and strong, and they'll be wearing simple but very well kept clothing, when it's likely that the reality was very different, and if most slaves were only given 1 or 2 garments a year, it would have been very difficult to maintain them. While the clothing of field slaves would have been relatively simple in construction, those who worked in the plantation household would have had a slightly different wardrobe. Household slaves would have been on display to visitors to the plantation, and so their clothing would have been used to reflect the status of their owner. Similar ideas can be seen in the livery uniform of servants in 18th century Britain, where male servants were given smart jackets, breeches, white shirts, and even wigs, all of which were designed to reflect the elite fashions and show off the wealth and position of the master. The dress of female household slaves, for example, could follow the fashionable silhouette of their mistresses, and it would have been made out of slightly finer material compared with that of the house slaves. So instead of coarse linen cloth, it might have been made out of calico or chintz, which is a type of cotton cloth, and both of which could have been patterned and looked more decorative. But they wouldn't have been as fancy as the fabrics of that of the mistresses themselves. There was therefore a hierarchy within the slave community that was reinforced by the different types of cloth and clothing that were given to the slaves by their masters. What the enslaved people themselves felt or thought about this clothing, however, and how clearly it marked their place in society, is something that we can only imagine.